the stillness of midnight at Bagshot Park, a confidential order was quietly signed by Prince Edward I that would send shockwaves through royal corridors. No press release, no family meeting. Just one stroke of the pen and the entire legacy of Prince Philip's cherished trust was diverted. But to whom? And why now? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The air inside Bagshot that night was dense with unspoken purpose. Edward had waited for the house to sleep, for the advisors to retreat, and for the silence to grant him the clarity his conscience demanded. Alone in his study, with only a single desk lamp illuminating decades of responsibility, he signed a document that would unravel a quiet yet intensifying battle within the royal family. Without informing King Charles or Camilla, he authorized the formal transfer of the Duke of Edinburgh's legacy trust, a trust birthed from Prince Philip's deepest values into the hands of someone he believed worthy. It wasn't about rebellion, it was about restoration. The Duke of Edinburgh's legacy trust had never been just another royal institution. It was Philip's heartbeat, a blueprint for empowering young minds through discipline, endurance, and noble service. For Edward, who had been promised this legacy by his father, it was sacred ground. But over time, that ground had shifted. He watched in mounting disbelief as Camilla, cloaked in the legitimacy of her new title, began inserting herself quietly, cleverly, into the trust's outreach programs. What began as simple patronage soon morphed into influence. New causes, different priorities, diluted principles. The rugged rigor that had once defined the trust gave way to softer initiatives, ones that felt alien to Edward's memory of his father. Royal aides began to whisper about it, hushed conversations in corridors, coded emails among long-serving staffers, all hinting at a growing dissonance between Camilla's vision and Edward's. To some within the palace, it appeared as an inevitable evolution. To others, it reeked of a silent coup. The trust that once honored naval cadets, built leadership in disadvantaged youth, and stood tall as Philip's legacy, now flirted with becoming a political trophy. Edward tried diplomacy. He appealed to Charles, who dismissed it as an overreaction. He requested meetings with the trust's board, only to find Camilla's allies sitting in seats once filled by his own confidants. The lines of power were being redrawn without his consent, and worse, without his father's values. Each month that passed tightened the knot in Edward's chest. His father had once said, "Legacies aren't inherited, they're protected." Those words haunted him, so he made a choice not out of revenge, but out of duty. If the monarchy wouldn't protect Philip's vision, Edward would. With one signature, he removed the trust from Camilla's reach, and with that same ink, he began what many would later call a seismic shift in the royal order. But before we uncover where Edward redirected the trust, we must first peel back the history of betrayal and ambition that led to this silent war. Before Prince Philip passed, he left behind not only a legacy, but a vision, one built on discipline, duty, and direct succession. But after his death, something shifted. Quiet alterations, subtle interference, and whispers that his wishes were being reinterpreted by Camilla herself. It began with a safe, locked tightly in the bowels of Windsor, where Philip's handwritten letters and sealed directives had been stored. These documents weren't meant for public eyes, they were for his children, especially Edward, whom he had long prepared to take up the mantle of the Duke of Edinburgh. In those pages were instructions not just on inheritance, but on stewardship. He spoke of a legacy forged in iron, not to be softened by time or diluted by royal politics. Yet, within months of his passing, the changes came, slow, calculated, and cloaked in courtesy. New faces appeared within the administrative circles of the trust Camilla's advisors, some of whom had never once engaged with the original mission but now spoke as though they had authored it. They arrived with gentle smiles and polished agendas, championing causes that seemed noble but were miles away from the ideals Philip had fiercely protected. What once prioritized rugged adventure training, naval discipline, and physical resilience began to shift toward wellness retreats, etiquette workshops, and lifestyle-oriented programming. Some insiders called it a modernization. Others, Those who had served under Philip's directive for decades called it erasure. Several long-standing staff members, quiet but fiercely loyal, attempted to raise alarms. Their concerns were brushed aside. A few resigned in protest. Fewer still dared to speak out, and those who did found their voices silenced by a well-oiled PR machine. The atmosphere turned cold, clinical. The trust no longer echoed with the spirit of Philip's intensity. It whispered with curated ambiguity. Behind the scenes, Princess Anne noticed. As Philip's most uncompromising child, she had always been a silent protector of his values. And though her public stance remained neutral, whispers of tense, closed-door conversations between her and Edward began to surface. It was Anne who reminded him, quietly but firmly, of what their father had once said, that true loyalty often meant stepping outside the comfort of protocol. Edward, caught between royal allegiance and personal duty, began to unravel under the weight of watching the trust mutate into something unrecognizable. He had been entrusted with more than a title, he had been given purpose. And now, that purpose was slipping through his fingers under the watchful eye of someone he could no longer see as an ally. Each new initiative launched without his consent was a cut. Each article praising Camilla's revitalization of the trust was salt poured into the wound. The breaking point didn't come in a moment of rage, but in a moment of silence. Edward stood alone, holding one of his father's final letters in his hand, reading the words again. "Hold the line, son, even when the tide turns against you." It was then he knew his father's legacy wasn't fading. It was being rewritten, and as Philip's original vision dimmed, Edward's resolve began to crystallize with one name firmly in his sights as the rightful torchbearer. She wasn't born into royalty, but she redefined it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained silent through scandal, poised through conflict, but behind palace doors, Prince Philip saw something others didn't. And Edward? He remembered every word his father once said about her. There was a quiet power to Catherine that eluded the flash of headlines. Where others postured for favour or manoeuvred through the currents of palace politics, she listened, observed, and endured. Philip had always admired strength not in loud declarations, but in steadfast restraint, and in Catherine, he recognised the rarest form of it. Staff recalled how he would often request her company for private walks in the gardens of Balmoral and Sandringham, not for appearances, but for counsel. These weren't casual strolls. They were, in Philip's mind, interviews, trials of character. And Catherine passed them, not with charming words, but with thoughtful silences and answers laced with conviction. They didn't speak of gossip or rivalries. They spoke of duty, of legacy, of the weight of the crown, and who was truly ready to carry it. In Philip's final months, those conversations grew more frequent. Edward was often present for some of them, and on one occasion, he recalled his father's eyes sharpening as he gestured toward Catherine and said, "She's the one with spine." That sentence etched itself into Edward's memory. It was neither casual nor hypothetical. It was a declaration, one that rang louder with every move Camilla made to reshape Philip's trust. For Edward, the contrast between Catherine and Camilla became unavoidable. One moved in shadows, expanding influence under the veil of tradition. The other stood in plain sight, asking for nothing, and yet commanding everything. Where Camilla's fingerprints smudged the trust's original design, Catherine's presence felt like an anchor, grounding it to its core mission. Rumours soon swirled that Philip, in private, had once expressed a wish that a woman like the Queen Mother, resolute, respected, untouched by vanity, might one day watch over the legacy he had built. That image stayed with Edward. And as he watched Catherine navigate public life with unwavering discipline, even amid personal storms, his father's unspoken prophecy seemed to crystallize before his eyes. Catherine wasn't seeking power, but that's what made her worthy of it. In an institution obsessed with titles, she embodied everything the monarchy claimed to value but rarely honored. Resilience without entitlement, elegance without excess, loyalty without question. Edward began to see her not just as family, but as the safeguard the trust desperately needed. While others debated modernization and relevance, She embodied timeless values, principles Philip would have defended until his last breath. And in her, Edward didn't just see an ideal, he saw the answer. The natural heir to a legacy that had been slowly strangled by political hands. His father's instincts had been clear, and now Edward's own path had become just as undeniable. But Edward's loyalty to Catherine was more than admiration. It became the centerpiece of a daring royal gambit. Sources allege it began with subtle adjustments, a new PR head here, a rewritten mission statement there, but soon, the Duke of Edinburgh Trust was no longer recognizable. And behind the transformation stood one shadow figure, Camilla. It started like a whisper, carried through the corridors of Clarence House and into the boardrooms of the Trust. Long-standing members, those personally appointed by Prince Philip, found themselves quietly replaced. No announcements, no warnings, just terminations cloaked as retirements, and new names appearing on meeting agendas without precedent. And those new names? Almost exclusively tied to Camilla's growing circle of influence. Her advisors, loyal to her style of soft power, took up positions that once answered to Edward. One by one, the stewards of Philip's vision were swept out, and in their place stood voices eager to modernize the Trust's mission. Only it wasn't modernization. It was redirection toward causes favored by the Queen Consort, not the late Duke. As the reshuffle deepened, funding began to shift. Programs rooted in naval discipline and outdoor endurance, cornerstones of Philip's design, were starved of resources. Meanwhile, fresh initiatives sprung up, lauded for inclusivity but criticized by insiders as wildly off-mission. There were murmurs of misalignment, but those murmurs were quickly muffled. A trail of internal memos, obtained from within palace walls, revealed mounting concerns. Senior staff expressed alarm over increasingly unauthorized direction from Camilla's office, pointing to abrupt budget reallocation and the insertion of advisors with no prior connection to the trust. Warnings were raised. Edward was informed, and for a moment, it seemed as though there would be correction. But when Edward brought the issue directly to Charles, the air turned cold. The king's response was brief, diplomatic, and devastating. "Leave it alone," he said. "We all must evolve." But Edward couldn't leave it alone. Not when the very DNA of the trust was being rewritten in real time. The final blow came when a confidential internal review commissioned discreetly by remaining loyalists was leaked. It documented, in painful detail, how the trust had been leveraged to serve Camilla's expanding patronage ambitions. It wasn't just about influence anymore, it was about ownership. The Duke of Edinburgh Trust was becoming a political tool, wielded under the guise of compassion, but strategically repurposed to elevate Camilla's own image as Queen Consort. To Edward, this was betrayal in its purest form, not only of his father, but of everything the monarchy was meant to protect. Within those pages of the leaked report, he saw the writing on the wall. Tradition had not simply been ignored, it had been stolen, and no one, not even Charles, was willing to intervene. That left only one man to act, one man to restore balance, one man to draw a line in the sand. With no recourse left, Edward prepared a move that would redraw royal lines in sand and blood. No cameras, no aides. Just Catherine and Edward, seated across from one another in the drawing room of Bagshot Park. He slid a single folder toward her. Her hands trembled, not out of fear, but the weight of what was being entrusted to her. It had been building for weeks. Every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every silent betrayal had brought Edward to this very moment. He had made the decision alone, but he couldn't carry the legacy alone. And there was only one person he believed capable of shouldering what was never meant to be tainted by politics. Catherine arrived without ceremony. She had sensed something deeper behind his message, "Come alone, we need to talk." She sat quietly, her posture calm, but her eyes searching for what words couldn't yet explain. Edward, never one for sentiment, took a long breath and began. "This," he said, placing the folder on the table, "was meant for someone like you. Inside was everything. The formal authorization." Catherine's gaze remained steady, but Edward could see it, the flicker of shock. the rise of uncertainty. She wasn't power-hungry. She had never asked for more than her duty required. And yet now, he was placing one of the monarchy's most storied institutions directly into her hands. At first, she hesitated, not out of fear of consequence, but reverence for what it meant. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Edward's reply came without pause. "It's not a gift, it's a responsibility. One only you can carry now." Minutes passed in silence before Catherine reached for the folder. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she looked to him, eyes filled with something heavier than surprise. Understanding. That moment, though private, would later be described by palace aides as a transfer more symbolic than any coronation. In a move that bypassed tradition and shattered protocol, Edward had declared that the future of Prince Philip's legacy would not be held by bloodline alone, but by character. That meeting, while unannounced to the public, was witnessed by one other, Princess Anne. Called in discreetly, she entered the room with the composure of someone who had known all along where the winds would eventually settle. She gave no speech, no approval, only a simple nod as Catherine accepted the burden. Insiders say Catherine wept quietly when she left the room, not out of fear but out of the magnitude of being seen, of being trusted in a world where trust was currency and loyalty, a rare jewel. Edward watched her go, knowing he had set something irreversible in motion. It was no longer about retaliation or symbolism. The legacy had been rescued. And its new guardian understood that this wasn't about appearance, it was about preservation. It wasn't about ambition, it was about honoring the will of a man whose voice could no longer defend his vision. But just as the ink dried and silence was sworn, Camilla's allies caught wind and retaliated swiftly. The moment news reached Clarence's house, phones rang off the hook. Camilla didn't wait for Charles, she made the first call. What followed was a flurry of threats, late-night summits, and a stunning confrontation between the Queen Consort and Edward himself. The transfer hadn't been public, but word travelled faster than anyone could contain. A well-placed whisper, a misdirected email, a suspicious silence from Edward's office by morning. Camilla knew, and she was furious. To her, it wasn't just an administrative change, it was a declaration of war. The Duke of Edinburgh's legacy trust had become, in her eyes, a visible extension of her reign. She had invested time, energy, and reputation into shaping it. But now, stripped of control in one silent move, she viewed Edward's action not as personal conviction, but as betrayal. That same evening, she arranged a private dinner at St. James's Palace, not a family meal, but an ambush dressed in formality. Edward accepted the invitation, knowing exactly what awaited him. The confrontation was swift. Camilla wasted no time with pleasantries. "This," she hissed across the table, "is a betrayal of the monarchy." Edward didn't flinch. Years of carrying the burden of silence had hardened him. He met her stare and responded with devastating calm. "This was never yours to touch." That sentence would later be repeated by royal insiders as the moment the rift between Edward and Camilla became unbridgeable. The table fell into silence, the kind that echoes louder than any shouted word. Camilla's fury simmered beneath a composed exterior, but Edward had made his point, and he wasn't going to retract it. Charles entered the fray days later, desperate to smooth the fracture. His attempt at mediation came with royal vagueness, cloaked in phrases like, "Unity must prevail," and "we can't afford division." But underneath the diplomacy, there was a sting of disappointment. He looked at Edward not as a brother, but as a disruptor. The monarch's tone was not rage, it was regret, the kind that seeks control under the mask of reason. Still, Edward did not bend. "This was about father," he said, "not favour." And with that, any illusion of reconciliation dissolved. In the chaos that followed, Catherine made a quiet yet jarring move. She withdrew from her upcoming public appearances. No explanation, no press release. Her absence spoke volumes. Royal aides scrambled behind the scenes, struggling to contain the fallout. Phone calls were rerouted. Journalists were misled. Statements were drafted and destroyed. The palace entered lockdown mode, hoping to extinguish the fire before it reached the press. But the tension was undeniable. Something had shifted. And while the public remained unaware of the storm brewing behind palace walls, those within the royal inner circle knew lines had been drawn, loyalties tested, and a new power struggle had begun. And yet, no royal storm lasts forever. What came next would redefine loyalty, legacy, and lineage. When the monarchy fractures, only one woman commands instant respect. Princess Anne, resolute, unshakable, and fiercely loyal to her father's ideals, stepped into the fray. And when she spoke, even Camilla was silenced. For years, Anne had remained the monarchy's quiet sentinel, unmoved by status, unfazed by scandal. But when the battle over the Duke of Edinburgh trust reached a boiling point, she could no longer stand by. This wasn't about preference, it was about principle. Anne had been there from the beginning. She had stood beside Philip during the early years of the trust's formation, witnessed its transformation into a cornerstone of royal service, and protected its values through decades of change. She knew the intent behind every policy, every tradition, every challenge it imposed. And now, watching Camilla manipulate its mission for personal legacy, Anne knew the line had been crossed. It began with a direct call to Charles, deliberate and uncompromising. "He's honouring father," she said of Edward, "not defying you." The words hit like a bell toll. Charles didn't interrupt, didn't object. Anne rarely offered her opinion unless it mattered. And when she did, it was always the final word in any debate. What followed was even more powerful. A public appearance alongside Camilla at a royal engagement, the first since the trust transfer. The tension was unmissable. Witnesses recalled a moment when Anne, standing a pace apart from the Queen Consort, uttered a phrase that would soon dominate headlines. "Legacy isn't a game." No one needed to ask whom she was referring to. That wasn't the end of it. Days later, Anne and Edward appeared together at a naval charity event, side by side, stoic and purposeful. It wasn't just a show of unity, it was defiance. A public declaration that the real guardians of Philip's legacy were not those who inherited titles, but those who inherited conviction. Cameras captured the rare moment of solidarity, and behind closed doors, the palace trembled. Anne had spoken, and by doing so, she gave Edward what he needed most: confirmation that he was not alone in this storm. But perhaps the most intimate moment came quietly, unseen by the public. A private assurance whispered from Anne to Catherine, who had taken on the responsibility with humility and grace, yet bore its weight with increasing isolation. "You are not alone," Anne said, her voice measured but unshakable. That sentence, simple as it was, echoed louder than any public endorsement. It was a passing of the torch from one defender of tradition to another. In that instant, the monarchy was no longer fractured, it was realigning. The tide was shifting, but the final act would not be decided by tradition, but the will of the people. In a stunning twist, the public made their voice heard not through riots, but roaring applause. As Catherine took the stage at a Duke of Edinburgh Youth Awards ceremony, the legacy came alive again. But for Camilla, the silence was louder than any cheer. The ceremony had been scheduled long before the chaos behind palace walls began, but its timing couldn't have been more poetic. For weeks, whispers swirled through Britain of betrayal, of honour, of legacy reclaimed. And now, the country watched as Catherine, wrapped not in power but purpose, stepped forward to represent a vision forged by Prince Philip himself. Her speech was brief, but every word struck deep. She spoke not of herself, but of service, of young people rising through adversity, of values that didn't change with seasons or titles. Her voice shook only once when she mentioned Philip by name. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, not out of formality, but out of belief. Within hours, social media erupted. Hashtags praising Catherine flooded platforms. Newspapers that had once remained neutral now ran bold headlines. Philip's legacy finds its guardian. A nationwide poll, conducted that very weekend, revealed a staggering 83% approval for Edward's decision to hand the trust to Catherine. It wasn't just a royal move, It was a public reclamation. Veterans who had worked alongside Prince Philip during the early years of the trust issued statements applauding the restoration of its original spirit. Youth programs that had once faced defunding under Camilla's redirected priorities were now reinstated and celebrated. For many, this wasn't a shift, it was a resurrection. Camilla, once front and center at these events, began to retreat. Invitations were declined. Engagements were reassigned. The palace's press office, usually meticulous, made no effort to explain her absence. The silence spoke volumes. Inside sources suggested she had been advised to avoid further controversy. But the truth was simpler. Camilla had lost the room, not by decree, but by consequence. Her influence over the trust had collapsed under the weight of public conviction. And then came Edward's voice, measured, rare, but unforgettable. In a quiet interview with a respected royal correspondent, he said the words that would echo far beyond Buckingham's gates. It was never about titles. It was about duty. That sentence captured the spirit of everything that had unfolded. It wasn't rebellion, it was restoration. And the public embraced it like a long-lost truth, finally spoken aloud. In the days that followed, the narrative shifted completely. Analysts once wary now praised Edward's courage. Commentators reframed the conflict not as a feud, but as a course correction. Camilla sidelined, Catherine rises. Read one headline that summed it all up. But for those closest to the center of it all, the story wasn't about power. It was about legacy one finally placed in the right hands, not because of blood, but because of belief. But behind every triumph lies a deeper truth, and one final revelation was yet to surface. In the archives of Windsor, locked within a mahogany safe untouched since Philip's passing, a letter was uncovered addressed to Edward. Its contents? A posthumous whisper from a father to his son, validating every move that had now shaken the crown. It was found not during a routine check, but in the quiet aftermath of Catherine's first speech as guardian of the Duke of Edinburgh's trust. A trusted staffer sorting through classified documents discovered a sealed envelope marked only with Edward's name. The handwriting was unmistakable, Philip's, firm and unbroken. Inside, on a single sheet of aged stationery, were words that would silence every critic and elevate Edward's defiance into destiny. If you ever must choose between politics and principle, it read, choose the latter, always. The world may misunderstand you, but history will not. It was a father's final instruction not to obey, but to lead. And in those carefully inked lines was the ultimate confirmation. Philip had foreseen this very conflict, and had entrusted Edward with the strength to endure it. What struck Edward most was the unexpected inclusion of a name, Catherine. Philip, long before any controversy, had written, "If the time comes when the trust needs a guardian of both strength and grace, I hope she will guard the torch." He read the letter in solitude at Balmoral, the very estate where he and Philip had last spoken about the future. Alone, surrounded by silence and memory, he wept. Not out of regret, but out of release. The doubts, the resistance, the accusations, it had all led to this moment. And now, there was no need for justification. His father had spoken, beyond death, and the message was clear. The letter was never leaked. It wasn't paraded in front of the press. She read it behind closed doors and said nothing for days. Then, one morning, aides noticed something new in her private study, a framed copy of the letter, hung just above her writing desk. It wasn't a trophy, it was a vow. And those who entered the room afterward said her presence had changed. There was still quiet, still humility, but now there was fire behind her eyes. In the days that followed, the royal family offered no public statement. There were no grand gestures or headlines. But the silence said it all. No more challenges. No more resistance. The storm had passed, and with it, an old era had closed its gates. For the first time in years, the trust stood free from manipulation, restored to its original mission. Not by accident, not by tradition, but by deliberate sacrifice. And the monarchy, fractured and shaken, had finally accepted a chapter they never expected to read. And with that, the legacy was no longer in limbo. It had found its rightful guardian. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.